I first became interested in the study of Irish society in the 1980s, towards the end of the 1980s, because I would have experienced a lot of the crises around the economy. I was very curious at understanding, the high rates of emigration and unemployment, but also, I suppose, more specifically, as a young girl in secondary school, being very much aware of events like the Kerry Babies case, the death of Anne Lovett at Granard, and so forth. And these were very vivid public events that I think both stirred and disturbed something in my consciousness. So out of that, I became very interested in this whole notion of crisis in Irish society and inequality around that time. Yes, I suppose I initially was very interested in the discipline of history. And one of the things I realised very quickly was that women were rarely mentioned or were invisible. Mary Cullen was the only person when I was a student in Maynooth who mentioned the role of women in Irish history. And that was quickly followed by the arrival of Professor Mary Corcoran in Maynooth, who was the first person to teach gender in sociology, which I also took. So I very quickly realised that whereas I still am very interested in the dialectic between history and social change, and that informs a lot of my work, I realised very quickly that I felt limited by history in the sense that it didn't explain enough to me why issues around gender, leading into that sexuality, family, all those areas of social life where the public meets the private. There seemed to be too much emphasis on the public role of formal politics, the state, which obviously I'm very interested in, but I felt that there was a missing link between the invisible world of women in particular, through the family, through sexualities, that wasn't being linked enough with public politics and with the public sphere. So that's why I began to look at the women's movement as a forum, a social movement, which reflected all of those public-private dilemmas, the interplay around the social inequalities that I talked about earlier, that I was interested in coming out of the 1980s, a very sort of bleak period, a very depressing period in many ways. So there were many, many questions that led me more into sociology, where you could begin to theorise and explain why that women in particular were invisible, and then look at the role of feminism in that sense of both challenging and transforming the dominant social order. Obviously, the family, if we can use that term anymore, it has undergone a process of profound transformation, particularly since the 1980s. And I suppose there's a number of factors at work there. Obviously, there's the changing role of women itself. So you have the very rapid entry of women into the labour force, particularly during the Celtic Tiger, young women with children. And that in itself suggests, if the role of women is changing in society, well, obviously the family is changing, because women have had such a central role as documented in the 1937 Constitution, which states a woman by her life within the home gives to the state a support without which the common good cannot be achieved, which is very interesting. Woman by her life as opposed to woman by her work within the home, and suggesting that the common good couldn't possibly be achieved if women weren't in the home. So both structurally in terms of the labour market, but also culturally, that's a significant change in terms of family and what family is and what it means. The other factor is what I suppose we could call the plurality of family forms that have emerged. A movement away from the traditional family, the two-parent lifelong marriage, towards a whole plurality of family forms, cohabitation, lone parent households, gay relationships. I noticed on the newspaper coming in this morning, gay marriage is now in the agenda. That would have been unheard of 20, 30 years ago. Homosexuality was only decriminalised in the 1990s. So I think possibly more than any other arena of social life of Irish society, family has undergone a very intense period of change. And Carol Smart would even go so far as to say we need to look at not just change in the family, but change in personal life. And and Ireland in particular is a very interesting case study in that respect, given its Catholic history and the traditional role of women. Yes, I mean it's very common to say that we live in a post-feminist era. That young women in particular prefer to say, I'm not a feminist. That it's kind of a dirty word, but I would tend to locate feminism in a broader historical context. I think there's nothing unusual in feminism being considered too challenging or too critical for the majority of women or men, for that matter. Uh, we could suggest that at all times the feminist movement or feminists have been the minority who, at various points, perhaps have been able to mobilise in a broader collective social movement. But that was brief in the 60s and the 70s. For the most part, feminism and feminist movements have been driven forward by smaller groups of women who do the kind of the slow burn work that's very necessary to keeping gender and women's rights on the agenda. I think I was reading with my first year students recently this text from the 1930s, Arnsberg and Kimball's study of rural Ireland. And one of the issues in that's documented is the woman was the last to go to bed and the first to get up in the morning. And we got into this discussion about how during the Celtic Tiger, with the entry of women with small children in particular into the workforce, that sort of double burden that's created of working both inside the home and outside it, what Arlie Hochschild calls the double burden. All the statistics, all the studies show that burden still falls predominantly on women. The first shift being going to work, the second when you go home, and the third in the night. So Arlie Hochschild has this great term, I think, which very much characterises where I suppose where I think feminism and the women's movement is at. She refers to this notion of the stalled revolution. She thinks the first revolution was the entry of women into the public world, where women can be lawyers, doctors, academics, and so forth. But that second revolution, which was supposed to happen in the sphere of the home, domesticity, family, hasn't happened to the same extent. And she would argue that until that happens, equality will not flow. So that's, I suppose, a rather depressing note to suggest that there's still fundamental inequality within the private realm of home and personal life. On the other hand, then you see new forms of activism emerging. Younger women are active in Irish feminist networks, Cork feministe, very much through new technologies, through new media. Feminism is very vibrant in academic work, even though it encounters resistance at times. So I think there's new forms of activism which are very different from that kind of idealised social movement activism of the 70s and the 80s. But I wouldn't suggest that feminism has disappeared or that there's necessarily a post-feminist era. I just see new forms of feminism emerging. I think it's very important because, I think we have to be careful. There has been a tendency, particularly in the more theoretical work on Ireland, to look at what's the most popular theory currently. So maybe in the 1980s or 1990s, it was post-colonialism or post-structuralism, and there's a tendency, I suppose, to draw on the most popular Western frameworks in particular and see, well, how do they apply to Ireland? So it's almost like you throw the theory and you see, well, how does that apply to Ireland? Whereas I always felt very strongly it's really important to develop out of empirical research, whatever the discipline. It could be literature, it could be sociology, to develop a very strong dialogue or conversation about perhaps the particularity of Irish culture and society, and to engage dialectically with those kinds of theories, but also to theorize in a sort of a bottom-up way. So that's where comparative work comes into play. It comes into play in terms of the theoretical frameworks that are being developed elsewhere, but also it's very important, if we want to use the family as an example, to compare, to compare, to try and understand, why does Ireland have the highest fertility rate in Europe? Why are we the oldest mothers, so to speak, in Europe? There's very interesting trends. And if we begin to look at other societies, particularly in a European context, we can begin to try and answer some of those issues. In terms of what we might describe as the mainstream of Irish studies, as it has developed since the 1980s, it has a very limited role. On the other hand, we could perhaps argue that sociology, or Irish sociology, is just as much part of Irish studies as literature and history, which seem to be the two main disciplines which have informed much of the debate. I think a debate is beginning to start about, for instance, the way in which a post-colonial framework can be better informed by research from a social science or sociological perspective, which actually tries to understand post-coloniality as it applies to everything from everyday life to the state to international trade, gender representation, culture, artefacts. So I think I see great potential. I mean, many of my colleagues would say, why bother with Irish studies? That's for, that's about literature, it's about writing. And whereas I see great potential for really building a true interdisciplinary perspective where we can begin to enrich and inform our understanding of Irish culture, society and history in all kinds of way. And there's a real dialogue. Often we think there's very little in common between people from different disciplines, but very often that's not the case. So I would see huge potential for interdisciplinarity.